Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration on action on all things to do with sustainability and building or rebuilding a stronger and more inclusive economy and indeed society. Thank you very much for joining us again today. We're delighted that we have an audience that comes from more or less all around the world and also all around the United States. And today we will be enjoying our Green Jobs Report and an update on what has happened over the last month, and taking a particular look at the role that public banks can play in accelerating and supporting the transition and the investments that are so desperately needed. Just as a very brief introduction, please do introduce yourselves to each other in the chat. Please say hello, tell us something about your interests or where you are. If you have questions, then also please post them in the chat or put them in the Q&A function. In the Q&A, it's easier for us to keep track, but either way, we will do our level best to answer anything reasonable that you put forward there. Also, if you are watching on social media, please do share with your friends. Please do post online. Please do send a link to the show now at live.esgx.org. And indeed, if you're there, then use the like button. That helps other people to find this. And I think with no more ado, I will pass over now to Paul Herman to introduce this month's Green Jobs Report. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Nigel. Welcome, everybody. Happy December 1st. This is the last month of 2020. And for the last Green Jobs Monthly Report, we're going to dig into public banking today after our recurring monthly jobs report presented by Amir Khalegi, who's a research fellow at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and a PhD candidate at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Also joining us today, Scott Fulweiler, a professor at University of Missouri, Kansas City, and our special guests, Raúl Carrillo and Sylvia Chi. So let's kick it off with Amir. Amir, welcome. Look forward to having you here, and please ask any audience, please ask any questions in the chat box. Amir, are you excited for 2020 coming to a close?
Well, excitement, anxiety, and everything, and I feel like the excitement comes from the solutions that we've been trying to figure out over the past 6 months. And hopefully we see a change for in the positive direction. And this is something that I stay optimistic for, and to think that our group and the things that we have been doing and pushing for, from the topics that we've been presenting with our various panelists, to see positive change from that is what I'm most excited for.
Super. Well, thanks for being optimistic. And so let's take a deep dive, Amir, over the next 8 to 10 minutes. Let's take a deep dive into the latest monthly Green Job Report that we've put together all year, and you can find on esgx.org. And then we'll kick off our panel after that. So go for it.
Perfect. So for those of you who are just joining us, or for those of you who are returning and need a refresher, our Green Jobs Report measures the greenness of various industries within the US economy. Examples of the different rated industries are, so those that are highly rated would be those of wholesale distributors of medical products or recycling services. Medium rated industries would be that of pharmaceutical manufacturers or hospitals, and low-rated industries would be that of oil and gas and casinos. Obviously, these are just examples. Our industries span from over 200 industries within the US economy. So the way that these industries are scored is that we take data from HIP Investor, Human Impact Plus Profit, which give a rating on over 2,000 companies within the United States based on performance, products, and management practices, which include detailed metrics in health, wealth, earth, equality, and trust pillars that focus on people, planet, and trust. These ratings for companies are mapped to various industries within the CES, and the purpose of this Green Jobs Report is to measure the direction and magnitude towards a more sustainable and greener economy as a whole. So what we have found is that jobs in greener industries have been the most resilient with the onset COVID-19 crisis. Proportionally, the greener rated industries have been the least impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. And since February, these greener industries have seen a reduction of 4.3%, while the lowest tiered industries have seen the highest proportional job loss with a reduction of 10.8% since February. We can move on to the next slide. So what we've noticed is that the jobs recovery is no longer experiencing meaningful gains in the US economy. So from April to June, we saw a return of around 8 million jobs to the US economy. And to be noted, the loss from February to April was around 20 million jobs within the United States. But the months following, the return of jobs has significantly declined. The change from June to July was around 1.5 million and has since declined, at an accelerating rate. From August to September, the return of jobs was around 890,000. When looking at the levels between February, the employment of the United States right now currently is still around 10 million jobs below the February level. And in the most recent month, the industries with the most extractive products recovered faster as compared to the greener rated industries. But something to be noticed too, this isn't, the graph that we're looking at right now is in terms of products and services, which is only the HIP investor rating, right, or the HIP rating, the human impact plus profit rating, encompasses products and services, but it also encompasses the management practices and their environmentally sustainable practices as well. But looking at products and services specifically, we saw that the products and services, or the industries that deliver the most extractive products and services, saw the highest gain in this month with a 1.74% increase from August to September. But with that being said, these jobs that returned weren't necessarily high quality jobs. This can be shown here in the reduction in pay for the extremely extractive industries. So the extremely extractive industries were the only industries to see a decrease in the average hourly earnings over the month, whereas the slightly extractive industries saw an increase of 4 cents per hour, while the green industries saw an increase of 10 cents per hour. And still, there's a significant difference between the green industries and that of slightly extractive industries and extremely extractive industries. And for a summary on the hourly earnings, we can see from that decrease that although that there was an increase in the extractive industries due to it being lowered by 2 cents, meaning that the jobs that returned on average were lower quality or lower pay as compared to the jobs that were currently in that bucket. So moving on, a portion that we look at is the high contact sectors. If you could go back just one more slide. So what we've noticed, right, is that obviously high contact sectors, due to the health risks, are more likely to have jobs destroyed due to the nature of the virus. And high contact industry sectors are industries that contain occupation occupations which require work to be within 1 arm's length, whereas low contact industry sectors contain occupations which allow for social distancing. High contact sectors since February have lost around 5.6 million jobs compared to low contact industry. This is significantly higher as compared to low contact industries, where low contact industries have lost around 3 million jobs since February. And this analysis of high contact and low contact industry sectors is a mimicked analysis from the St. Louis Fed, which was shown below on that graph. But something interesting that we have found is, although even in high contact sectors, greener industries were more resilient to job loss. So what we did was look at the industries within the high contact and low contact industries, and we had the ratings for these industries for industries within both the high contact and low contact. And we found when divvying them up with a cutoff of below 30 and above 30, that industries with a HIP score above 30 as compared to those below 30 were more resilient to job loss, even in the high contact industry sectors. So we can see here that comparatively that high contact industries with a lower HIP score saw a job or proportional job loss of 12.2%, whereas industries that were above 30 saw a reduced reduction of 8.35%. And this trend of higher HIP scored industries being more resilient was also found within the low contact industries, where low contact industries that were above 30 saw around a 4.6% reduction, whereas those in the below 30 category saw a reduction of 7.5%. So the key takeaway here is that even in high contact industry sectors of the economy, greener jobs remained more resilient to job loss when compared to the extractive jobs. So now turning to our discussion of public banking and its role in greening the economy. For a quick background on public banking, publicly owned banks are financial institutions that are owned by one or more public entities, such as a city or county. And primarily, they invest, lend, and provide banking services for the local communities. Distinctively, public banks focus on the community needs as opposed to prioritizing shareholder returns. These needs can span anywhere from affordable housing, small business loans, or public infrastructure, but it isn't limited to that. It's completely focused on whatever the needs of that specific local community may be. So we can ask the question, how can public banks accelerate in the green transition? The goals of public banking align with ESG and HIP ratings. The public banking initiatives aim to deliver a sustainable economic, social, and environmental development, which is congruent with the promotion of health, wealth, earth, equality, and trust pillars that focus on people, planet, and trust. The principles of public banking encompass social and environmental sustainability, a focus in local communities, building long-term relationships with clients that help with self-sustaining growth, and they hope to provide opportunities that are resilient to external disruptions and conduct themselves with transparency in all their business transactions. So the public banking's motivation is, the leaders of these public banks hopefully already have the focus on people, planet, and trust, and it inspires that throughout their business dealings and the people they employ. Their model is focused on a triple bottom line that focuses on people, planet, and profit. They hope to contribute provide contributions to communities and the real economies within the specific communities, and basing investments on their specific needs. They hope for the creation of long-lasting relationships with clients and to provide information on proper risk analysis for those prospective clients. This is to ensure resilience, hopefully to outside disruptions. Obviously, there's disruptions that are unavoidable and we can't be resilient to, but we can do the best that we can by creating these, institutional outlooks in terms of what we're trying to provide. And one of those things that we're trying to provide is also transparency at a high degree through inclusiveness and comprehensive reporting. And hopefully with all these things set in place, we can start to inspire a societal mindset shift towards people, planet, and profit, as opposed to just profit. And something that's often spoken about in our Green Jobs Report is that it is unlikely to see a huge step towards greening the economy, but by taking marginal small steps towards the right direction with initiatives such as public bankings, it can start a snowballing effect. So hopefully over the years, hopefully a societal mindset shifts to people, planet, and profit, as opposed to just maximizing profit, we can, hopefully attain that excitement of seeing a greener economy that we spoke about in the beginning.
Super. Amir, thanks for the deep dive into the green jobs. Great to continue to see that greener jobs pay more and appear to be more resilient, even in high contact industries. So there's a positive return on investment by investing in people and planet and trust by corporates. And so that'll be what's interesting in our discussion today, because we're going to dig deeper into public banking, is there's already a couple of questions in the audience from Martha Turner and Michael Savant, and also from Sandeep Narwani. So this will be sort of the kickoff to our panel, I think. So Scott and Raúl and Sylvia, if you can join us. I'll greet all of us and then kick it off with these three questions that are all of a similar flavor. So Sylvia, thanks for joining us. You're part of the California Public Banking Alliance and policy director of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. So great to have you with us today. And Raúl Carrillo, you're Deputy Director of the LPE Project, so I want to know more about that, and Associate Research Scholar at the Yale Law School. So great to have you with us, and Dr. Scott Fulweiler from University of Missouri, Kansas City. Sylvia, today you're going to speak to some local experience with public banking, and Raúl, at least national and possibly international. But just as a grounding question, is public banking only publicly owned banks, like a government bank, like the state of North Dakota, which is a longtime public bank? Can it be a banking for public benefit? And if it's banking for public benefit, are there any distinctions about nonprofits versus for-profits, especially like credit unions or nonprofit financial institutions? So Sylvia Raúl, you want to kick it off with what's included when we talk about public banking?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it in terms of how we envision it from the perspective of the Public Banking Act, which I helped draft with Representative Rashida Tlaib's office, among other co-sponsors. And then perhaps, Sylvia, you can talk about it with respect to how you see California public banking missions. But if you'd like to proceed first, you're welcome to.
Yeah, sure. So in California, so I helped write the bill AB 857 that we passed in 2018. And so when I talk about public banking, that's what I'm thinking of, the AB 857 banks, which are to be owned by local governments, like cities or counties or combinations thereof, which is not to say that nonprofit financial institutions are not important and have the a critical role in the financial ecosystem, but just trying to distinguish and clarify what could be the role of government, and particularly local government. So that's why I distinguish public banks as government owned. But there are lots of different definitions that different people use in different contexts.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree there's a plurality of definitions within the discourse in the literature. And you have to remember that this conversation is not just about potentiality in the United States, nor what we've accomplished and what Sylvia and her crew have accomplished directly in California, but about a global and historical perspective, right? There are plenty of public banking systems that are operating across the world right now, including in Germany, Brazil, a robust postal banking system in Japan, etc. But I think that when we're talking about public banking at both the movement level and the legislative level in the United States, we're fundamentally talking about government or community-controlled entities. Ownership is a bit of a tricky term, especially when we're talking about government corporations. And I don't want to get into the debate about whether shareholders truly own corporations or not. But I think suffice it to say, for the public banks that Representative Tlaib's bill aims to incubate, those will be, the stakeholders will be public, or they will be community nonprofits. And so, as Sylvia said, where there's very much space for partnerships with institutions that may have different ownership structures, and many local efforts are more geared to that than others. Fundamentally with the Public Banking Act, and I think most of the movements across the country right now, we're talking about entities that are controlled by municipalities, state, or directly by community.
Okay. So the discussion may focus on that, but it sounds like there's multi-sector partnerships that are possible.
Absolutely.
Great. Scott, did you want to say something before we dig into an example?
I don't know that I have anything to say. I'm just kind of got into the California law a little bit, but I'd be curious, yeah, about how that came about and what's going on.
Yeah, Sylvia, you want to explain sort of how that came about and how it all came together?
Sure. So this was a totally grassroots campaign, almost entirely volunteer based. And I think a lot of us, and myself in particular, I came to this area of work out of an interest in divestment, and particularly the No DAPL movement, which is about the Dakota Access Pipeline. And what I experienced was I live in Oakland in California. I went to Oakland City Council when our city's contract with a bank was up for renewal, and spoke out with a couple other community members saying, these are all the terrible things that this bank is doing, leveraging our city deposits to finance, which are directly impacting the city. We should try to find another bank, and discover that there were really no alternatives under current California law, and figured out that it was basically more politically achievable to start this public banking movement in California and create this new law than to change the other laws. And there's, as I got more into it over time, learned about a lot of the other great benefits of public banking. So that's basically how I came to it. We put together a coalition of chapters of the California Public Banking Alliance all across the state, from San Diego, I know some members are here, to Humboldt, and managed to bring in a lot of partners of community groups, environmental groups, labor to support this as just another toolbox, another tool to add to the toolbox in terms of financing and public financing.
And what, so what was the constraint? Like the problem is, at least in California and potentially other states, it has been the case where you need a certain size bank for a city. And so some smaller banks can't serve cities even if they're more community oriented. So is that now not a constraint anymore, or is it forcing larger institutions to do something for public benefit?
The size is still an issue. So that's, what we're trying to do is create public banks that can hold the deposits for cities like Oakland. There just aren't any local community banks who are able to, that had the capacity to hold those deposits. So yeah, I think one thing we would like to do is, stand up these public banks to hold those deposits, but also to create the pressure on the existing mainstream banks to show them, this is the public option that is creating competition for you for municipal deposits, and hopefully have some effect on, their policies.
Okay. And what would you say are the 3 or 4 or 5 or more key ingredients in this recipe for public bank? Obviously, the law is not enough. Just having Community Reinvestment Act is not enough. So creating a law to have a public bank to be competitive. But what is in that law? Like if other people on this call help facilitate that in other states, what would be the components of it?
I think one reason that this law was successful was that it really leans into like local control and allows different localities to have different business plans and structures. So it's really important, I think, for as we organize public banks, that community groups are involved in developing what that business plan and structure looks like, making sure that the public bank really serves a public mission. The law by itself does not ensure that, so it still requires, community participation. Another big important ingredient is funding. We were initially planning on working on implementation of AB 857 this year, but because of the economic downturn, none of the localities who are interested in it previously are interested in it anymore. It's probably not going to happen really soon without some outside help. So now we're working on a proposal to see if we can get more support from the state to help localities start working on that and developing their business plans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's kind of a good segue, perhaps, to talk about the national bill that Raúl was working on.
Sure thing.
Okay.
Sorry, didn't mean to catch you off.
No, you're good. I'll just let you just take it away.
Great. So I hope we can get a virtual round of applause for the folks in California, just real quick, because they've done it. They've passed the bill. And we are hoping to incubate and facilitate similar efforts with the Public Banking Act introduced by Representative Tlaib. And what this legislation does is provide fundamentally 2 ingredients that you need to get a depository institution. One, it applies the charter, and 2, it capitalizes local efforts that meet certain standards, especially related to greening, as well as affirmative lending, broader notions of sustainability and communal health, right? And sort of to return to some of the themes that I think were present in the discussion, what this fundamentally does is both create services that I think are necessary for achieving the sort of outcomes in the world that we all want to see, perhaps lending to green businesses and cooperatives where there is no place to get that sort of financing, etc.
Yeah. So Raúl, thanks for that deep dive. Just so you know, some of your words are getting mangled or smashed together. I think we'd probably be okay if you skip video, if that helps. Zoom does a pretty good job of compressing, like in Silicon Valley, inside out.
Apologies for that, Paul. I'll take off the video.
Yeah, no problem. And if there's any other software that's open, you might try closing that as well. But, sorry, there's always many puzzle pieces to clear video conferencing. So, Sylvia, like on Raúl's point about financing, it sounds like cities have struggled to maybe access some financing, so they're relying on state financing, or is it relying on federal financing? Like, what are the pockets of money? Is it only government money that funds a government bank, or are there depositors? Could domestic or international investors invest in a public bank? And if so, what would they get?
Yeah, that's a good question. Under AB 857, those public banks have to be entirely owned by government agencies. But there are certainly
annual budgets.
Excuse me?
Out of annual budget. Usually government agencies are funded by annual budgets. It's hard to get like multi-year capital programs. So
yeah, it doesn't say like, there's no requirements about like exactly how it's funded. Part of those details are to be worked out in the regulations, which they have not, they're still working on. Yeah, and it's certainly the case that there are public banks in other places, other countries, that are a combination of public and private funding or public and private deposits.
But in California, that's not permitted, or is permitted?
That's not currently the law. And I think that's partly because it was a simpler story to tell, just to say public only. I think it just is more complicated to also include private.
Got it. Scott, have you seen any models on that?
So with respect to the federal bill, I think we draw some pretty clear distinctions. But first, I think it's important to keep a conceptual delineation in mind between deposits and investment, right? So these public banks will, ideally be handling municipal deposits, but of course, if they originate loans, then there may be deposits at the bank, and those may migrate, but you can foresee different situations in which the deposits of public and private actors are housed within a public bank. But the investment, I think, for the federal bill remains fundamentally federal, and indeed is the point that the Federal Reserve will help capitalize these banks, but it's a right or an entitlement with corresponding responsibilities, right? And so it's paired with federal banking regulation, and that's fundamentally the idea driving this bill, right? Is that you won't get private investors, and you won't be answerable. You won't have to answer to private shareholders. Instead, the decision that is made by the folks who create the public bank is that it will be, in exchange for the federal funding, you follow these guidelines with respect to safety and soundness, with respect to sustainability, et cetera.
Got it. And so therefore, where does that money come from, Raúl? Is that the Federal Reserve? Is that Congress? Like, how does that funding get produced?
Yeah, so ours is from the Federal Reserve, and we're not. It's from the Federal Reserve in the sense that money is, and the idea is that this could be modulated, perhaps based on the menu of charters that we have available. The bill, again, wants to incubate various different kinds of banks depending on what people want. And these may be retail level banks. These may be wholesale banks. These may be, banks that primarily exist to facilitate ongoing local financial services provided by CDFIs. It could be a number of different things. Right, the idea is that the capitalization comes from the federal government. And that is, again, the package that is offered. And in speaking with regulators, the sense is that it doesn't make sense to do one without the other. And I think it's a very common sense approach to pair, again, these sort of privileges with responsibilities, which is something that has been lost, arguably, in the private financial system in some respects, as I think you all discuss. And we always have to think about public banking in the backdrop of the rights and responsibilities of, quote unquote, private banks, which are also fundamentally corporations given charters by the government and expected to do certain things.
And so Raúl or Sylvia or Scott, if you know, like today, there's trillions of dollars of deposits in the banking industry. What do you think the potential market share or dollar volume could be in the US or globally of public banking versus private investor-owned banks?
So
Go ahead.
No, please, Sylvia. I was about to ask Scott if he wanted to take that one. This is, I think, a better question for an economist that I'm not so great at handling. But I would expect the impact to be, small at first in terms of share, but I couldn't give you a number.
Yeah, I don't have a number. I was gonna look up a number that some scholars have come up with, depending on how you define what a public bank is. There's, folks have said that there's trillions of dollars held in public banks currently, globally, but it's a pretty large range. I don't remember the exact number right now, but it's in the trillions.
Yeah, I'll say two things on that, I guess. We know that there are millions of people who are unbanked. We know that there are probably millions of people that would switch that are currently banked to a public bank. I can't give any magnitudes on that. Maybe somebody watching or listening knows some details on that. I think, not that anybody here is doing that, but just want to make clear the distinction that the ability of a public bank to support the community with its financial activities, lending, and so forth, does not rely necessarily on it obtaining, so many millions or billions of dollars of deposits. So we just want to make sure we separate those two things.
Right. So some other, choices that depositors could make would be the impact of their deposits, which today, if you put money in a Citibank or a Bank of America, you don't know where it goes. Is part of the public banking appeal is that there's transparency about where things are going and there's more reporting. Maybe there's impact reporting. Maybe it even goes, gets targeted to community zones, not just attached to the job cuts, tax cut law. Sorry, I said job cuts, I meant tax cut law. So is that part of the requirement, Sylvia, like in California? Because when opportunity zones got integrated into the tax cut law, the impact reporting got stripped out in the, before it was finally approved. So the opportunity zones were approved, the financial benefit was approved, but the impact, transparency, and reporting was removed. Is there any of that built into the California law, or Raúl, the federal law?
Yeah, for the California law, there isn't a very strong enforcement mechanism to ensure that. There is a requirement that the public bank be incorporated as a public benefit or mutual benefit nonprofit corporation. So there's a possibility of enforcing that through the AG's office. But there are robust transparency requirements. We incorporated elements from the existing California public records law and good governance laws to ensure as much transparency as we thought would be practicable in the context of a bank.
Okay. Because historically also there have been things like kiva.org as a nonprofit where you could see, you know, or GoFundMe, where you can have that visibility.
So I think this raises, this is a good opportunity to discuss sort of how we think about this in the divestment space, especially at the retail level. So as Scott indicated, you know, it's not really about where your money goes. A bank is a much more complicated financial actor than a GoFundMe or a Kiva, right? And it's approaching things from, you know, a consolidated balance sheet level and not necessarily, you know, just like cash in, cash out, or thinking about that way is not particularly helpful. So I would say, though, that to your point, a stronger way to look at it is that the federal bill, and I think most of the public banking movements across the country, bake these sort of requirements into the force of law, into the charter, right, and into the regulations. And in fact, banks have to meet certain criteria. It's public because it's government regulated and government regulation of government entities. And you will be able to see how the banks meet their metrics. And if they don't, I can be pretty sure that you'll hear about it, because public banks are going to be even under more scrutiny than private banks, right? And so people, I think, will have a strong sense of not so much, again, where their money goes as, you know, what the bank they're in bed with is doing, or the bank that they're in business with is doing. And that, I think, is sort of a fundamental feature of creating public banks and why they appeal to so many people across the world.
Mm-hmm. And Raúl or Sylvia or Scott, is there, you know, there's the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there's these 17 UN SDGs. It's intended to be a global framework for solving problems, either at the local level or the global level. And these 17 goals have 169 metrics as proof of solving some of those problems. There's not data on all of those metrics. But is there a benefit to financial institutions having, you know, a group of public banks across borders trying to do that, a group of public banks across state borders doing that? Do the SDGs help to bring capital that cities and states are striving for in California or nationally or globally?
So I'm not sure that the Sustainable Development Goals bring capital, again, because the capitalization in the for prism of the federal bill is done by the government, and I think in the California bill is also done by the government. But the sort of alliance around metrics and indices and the sort of thing that you all work on, I think there is a huge face for this. And again, just because you know, they're public banks doesn't mean we're out of the woods in terms of accountability. I have a lot of problems with the government. I'm sure that you do. And so there's going to have to be a lot of accountability here. And when I think about accountability, I'm not thinking about, you know, is the bank an appropriate, you know, use of federal money, so much as what is the bank doing and what is the bank accomplishing? And is it following its mission orientation for which, you know, it was chartered and capitalized in the first place? And we have instances wherein public banks don't always follow their missions, or their missions aren't unclear. And I want, you know, I don't want the listeners on the show to think I'm overly, you know, glassy-eyed or rosy about this. The Bank of North Dakota is the single, you know, established mainland public bank for now until Sylvia and the rest of the crew get up and running. And it, you know, financed the, for instance, the police presence at the Standing Rock protests, which I think environmentalist folks would not appreciate to hear. But the Bank of North Dakota was also founded in 1919, and there aren't any sustainability goals written into its charter, much less the constitutional law that surrounds it within the state of North Dakota. So this is where design is important, right? And I think that constant pressure on the design to hold it accountable is a feature of public banking. And people having a better sense, I think, you know, to your set of points, Paul, of what public money is doing and what these entities are up to is a great thing, and it's sort of a even cultural benefit of the Public Banking Act that we probably do well to talk more about.
All right,
I have a
and
quick question.
Sylvia, Sylvia, you answered a question in the chat, but just for everybody's benefit, the question is from Martha Turner. Are there any legal barriers or bonding capacity to fund some of those public banks? And sounds like you said no, there aren't any barriers to using muni bonds or other financing. Are you aware of that being considered for any cities seeking to do that currently, or can that fund even climate action projects?
Yeah, I think some cities are considering it. It's still a bit early, so nothing too concrete yet. I think that there's just there continues to be some general barriers about doing munis. In California, you need to get a 2/3 majority vote, I think, for local municipal bonds. So I think it's primarily a political obstacle.
Okay, let me ask a question here about I think I'm asking about the Federal Reserve's role in the Federal Banking Act, but we'll see. So we know with private organizations that they're non-loss organizations, and people like ourselves can do ratings and et cetera on how sustainable they are, how well they treat people, how well they treat their communities, et cetera. At some point, if you are a non-loss organization, at some point you have a financial survival constraint that you have to meet, and that may override some of the other decisions, right? And we're of course trying to minimize this in the work that all of us are doing here. I'm just curious. One of the things we know with the Fed, of course, it can backstop all sorts of things like what just happened over the last 8 months, and it doesn't have to worry about a financial survival constraint. So I'm curious about on the federal bill, or maybe there's something going on with the California one too, in terms of financial survival constraint issues for public banks. Is there something? What happens on that end? Does that question?
So I'm happy
sense?
to. Yeah, I think I get where you're headed here, Scott. And I think
Can they go bankrupt?
Yeah, perhaps a good place to start, I think, and I'll sort of just try to complement this point from a legal design point of view, is that I think we need to be honest about what the whole banking system is, which is at the end of the day underwritten by the Fed, right? So when we're talking about creating, or backstop by the Fed, to put it as you did, when we're talking about creating additional, excuse me?
Same thing, yes.
I'm a lawyer.
I'm agreeing with you.
I'm not using my definitions, Scott. But anyway, I think when we're talking about the banking system and what it fundamentally is, banks are chartered, licensed, regulated, in some ways administrated on a macro level by the government, right? And so it's sort of a little bit silly, especially from my perspective as a scholar of banking law and of the legal history of banking, to think in terms of government intervention or subsidy, right? Or to think that the banks that already exist do not take advantage of, Fed privileges, or be forced to, or one way or another be rescued by the center of the system. And in fact, the system is built that way, right? We have deposit insurance and we have the discount window, and the Fed fundamentally, legally, as well as economically, operates as the lender of last resort. And so when I think that perspective is helpful when you think about the regulation of public banks and what we're going to do to keep them, solvent, and what we're going to do to keep them stable. As a general matter, and I hope this hasn't been unclear, but we expect the banks to be financially sustainable. But what that means is something different than for a commercial bank, right? Because the triple bottom line here is not so much focused on profits as it is, again, the financial and safety and soundness of the bank more broadly written, because the bank's not trying to turn a profit, and it doesn't answer to private shareholders either. And so while ROI or profits might be a somewhat helpful metric, I don't think it really speaks to what we want to measure out of what we're getting out of a public bank, right? Which is, again, what is it creating? How, what is it investing in itself? What are we accomplishing socially? And what really happens is, again, I think that now that the backstop is more clear with public banks compared to private banks, is that regulation is 10 times easier, right? And you'll see that in this bill, and it's just legislation. It's not all the rules that will be promulgated by various agencies if the legislation were to be enacted. But you can see in the legislation that we are baking in, that certain goals have to be met, that certain metrics will have to be met with respect to safety and soundness if the bank is to continue as a supported concern, right? But at the same time, we are not going to pull the plug on a public bank because of, because we are applying a metric from the private sector and we're saying it's not doing well by that metric. And this becomes especially important when we talk about things like the pandemic, right? You want the Fed, supporting local and public banks if they existed right now. You'd want them to be helping localities that are in trouble with bonds or just flat out don't have the revenue. You want to be helping the states that have to comply with balanced budget amendments. And so we don't want to bring, I think, an austerity mindset so much as a responsibility mindset to the public banking system, if that makes sense.
Great. So we're getting near the top of the hour. There's one more question here, and at least an idea. We have people from fossil-free alliances, including in California and other states, for climate action. And cities do have to deal with muni bond capacity, whether it be for climate projects or public banking institutions. So are there narrow, there's things like green banks and green funds and infrastructure funds and I-banks in California, for example, infrastructure bank. So does it make sense to narrowly constrain a charter of a public bank to a specific use like climate that also benefits the community, or does it benefit it to have like a wider charter as needs change over time?
I'll say in California, I think we do have an iBank already, which is basically a revolving loan fund. Mm-hmm. And they just last year codified the Climate Catalyst Fund within it, but did not provide any funding for it. So one thing that we're looking at the California Public Banking Alliance is ways to modernize the iBank. And part of that would be providing support to localities for AB 857 banks, but also to try to actually make the Climate Catalyst Fund real and make it effective, and also to expand the mandate, because the iBank's mandate is pretty narrow right now. For example, it's prohibited from doing lending on housing when California is currently in a really intense housing crisis. So I think that, depending on the political context you're in, that you're working in, it might make sense to have a narrower mandate, but I think there's a lot of benefits in having a really broad one. And particularly you can and I think this is like really goes to the idea of like a Green New Deal, is to break down silos and be able to work across different sectors together. And I think public banks could really do a lot there.
Yeah, I will say that the federal bill wants to support a variety of different types of banks, and some of these public banks can engage in a more comprehensive set of functions than others. And a lot of this is sort of, mirrored off of the general, I think, positive approach that folks took in California of creating new categories, right? The old legal categories like don't necessarily fit or apply to what we want to do here. So we're creating a new menu of options. And the federal bill anticipates, for instance, getting a charter to provide payments in just basic financial services, or to lend or engage to infrastructure lending. And that menu, I think, can be, adjusted even further through regulation, not to mention subsequent discussion of the bill, which, hasn't passed yet. There is, I think, and I think Sylvia and I are on the same page here in that part of the spirit behind public banking is supporting a variety of functions, and some banks may want to do more different kinds of things than others, but really this is about facilitation, right, and helping with a more bottom-up approach. And there are other public banking approaches. For instance, Representative Tlaib also supports postal banking as a consumer retail level across the country, and Fed accounts, the possibility to have a digital account at the Federal Reserve. But this really is about empowering, I think, localities to do these sorts of different things, and from my perspective, to engage in the Green New Deal and the broader environmental just transition effort more fully.
Well, it sounds like a really exciting future, and private public banking. I wrote private banking, public banking, postal banking, digital accounts at the Federal Reserve. So, Scott, is there anything else you want to sum up with before we close?
I think maybe quickly, there are people that want to get involved with this. What do you, Raúl or Sylvia, suggest they do?
For California, if you're interested in joining the California Public Banking Alliance, check out our website, which is californiapublicbankingalliance.org. It's very long, and see if there's a local chapter near you. And if not, I think there's a link for you to get in touch and see if we can help you set up a local chapter in your part of California.
We put that link in the chat. And Raúl, how can we all take more action?
Yeah, so there are ongoing efforts in New York City, Oregon, Washington, Chicago, to my understanding, bubbling up in Miami. There's a team in West Virginia. There are quite a lot of efforts around the country already. So you should dig into that. Of course, most activism is online these days, unfortunately, but that does mean that you can, find folks in your area. And if you don't find that a coalitional effort already exists, such as exists in California and New York, then perhaps you work with or know groups that are responsive to people in the community that can start thinking about this. And it doesn't happen without people power, right? As so many folks will tell you. And if it's the case that you want some, tips on how to organize within a coalitional effort, all these other folks who have already done it are out here. And, I'm around and happy to put people in touch with each other, etc.
Fantastic. I want to thank our guests, Raúl Carrillo of the Law and Political Economy Project at Yale University, Sylvia T. of the California Public Banking Alliance, and Dr. Scott Wiley of the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Thanks also Amir for the monthly Green Jobs Report, and to our producer, Nick Gower. Nigel, you want to wrap up and summarize?
Sure. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you all for a fascinating discussion. I think it's been incredibly helpful, certainly to me. There are a host of challenges that has to be addressed, and I think we all know what those are, so I won't repeat them here. And the more sources of financing and ways to approach these problems that are available, I think clearly the better. As we head towards the end of the year, I was just going to flag a couple of things. Firstly, we've covered all sorts of topics on the Green Jobs Report and indeed ESGX Live more broadly this year. Thanks to Fidel Kaboub as well for helping with the Green Jobs part of that. And all of that material is available on our website or is available on the YouTube channel at live.esgx.org. Looking ahead into next year, if there are topics you would really love us to cover, or if there are guests you would love us to get on the show, and particularly from the more diverse their backgrounds, the better, then please let us know. You can just write to us at info@esgx.org, and that will come through to Paul and me, and we'll be able to build that into our program as best we can. And I think finally we have coming up next week Power Shift, where we are going to explore the impact of the changes in US energy policy that will come about as the Biden administration comes into power, and indeed some of the geopolitical shifts that will come with that because of the dynamics between the United States and the UK, and indeed Australia and China. And there, I think, are some very positive implications of all of that. Lots of complexity too. I don't know, Paul, if you want to add anything in terms of the guests we've got coming next week, but I think this is going to be a really fascinating episode, so please do sign up.
Yes, Jigar Shah from Generate Capital, who is very active on leading action as well as discussion, will join us, as well as Chris Castro from the city of Orlando, and an active leader in the state of Florida and the Orlando metro area. And we may have one or two more panelists, but please join us for Power Shift next week on ESGX. And the following week, our last ESGX episode of 2020 will feature Green Santa, who will join us from the Green North Pole. So please sign up for the ESGX next week for Power Shift, and December 15th for the holiday celebration. Nigel, anything else?
Last thing, simply please do share with your friends. Please do share links to the episode. Post on social media. Thank you to our official tweet manager of the day, Fidel, who's done a fantastic job. Please visit the YouTube site and share. This helps to amplify all of our guests' messages, makes a really big difference. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing